Hello, good evening. In the first time in 5 years, we'll have this event in German, which means you will have to deal with my very bad German, but you will mainly hear Wolfgang Streeck talk in German, and his German is very good. First, the formal issues. These events are only possible because of the support of Helle Panke, the foundation, the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, and the OXI blog, Think Economy Differently. It's a newspaper that you will be able to find over there. I also want to thank Florian and Oscar. They are the ones who are translating, interpreting tonight. We are live streaming today's event via YouTube for the people who do not understand German, but who will want to be joining us. Also want to thank our technician, Sven Bukin, and our interpreters are sitting in Switzerland and in Frankfurt, and we are here. So I also want to thank Frank, who organizes these events. So far for the formal issues, a couple of words about Wolfgang Streeck. We're very honored to have him here tonight. For me, Wolfgang Streeck is a very special person. I'm not sure if you know what Brave New Europe is. It's a blog. It's about economy, politics, climate science. Yannis Varoufakis would say it's for adults. So we have a very academic audience, and sometimes there are people who say, I would like to know more about German politics. Would you mind, or could you tell us some authors? And I always reply to these people, Wolfgang Streeck is a very good author. And when they ask, who else? And I always answer, there is nobody else who is worthy to read. Wolfgang has a quality that is very unique. No matter what I've already read of his, or what I've heard about him, every time I leave the book and I really have learned something significant, because very often today stuff is repeated, and I think it's the highest honor to be able to say, I learn a lot from you. And I am also honored if people tell me, it's nice what you've written, but Wolfgang is always like this. And personally, I like that a lot. And also many other people enjoy that. And with that, I give it over to Wolfgang. Thank you very much. I have a slight cold, and you might notice that sometimes I will be coughing, but don't worry, it's not lethal. And it's no longer contagious because it's very extended so far. I want to say something about nation states tonight. In the materialist or Marxist or also leftist theories, we always talk about the state as if it's a function. This is a very functionalist point of view. And I want to counterpose that with a historically concrete, empirical point of view. I want to talk about the nation states. And I want to talk about them in today's historical period. So what do we actually know about the structure of the nation state system? And also, what chances does this system of nation state have for progressive leftist politics, or might not? In what way does it have to be designed in order for it to have new property and corporate structures? So new egalitarian distributive systems will be encouraged, new participatory measures. And in order for that to be possible, how do nation states have to look? How do they have to be organized? They have to be organized towards the inside. And in order to do so, I want to say some very basic matters. They will also reflect on the current situation in Europe, but also on the situation of the European Union, its structure, what is its possible, what can it possibly add, in what way would it have to be potentially reformed? And of course, if we talk about nation states, I can really tell that. Where do we see the different emancipation, autonomy, these different aspirations? So we have an international corporate system and not a dictatorial system. But I think that we, in the widest sense of the term, if we are on the left of the political spectrum, we have to deal with these questions in a very new way. So if we think about the nation building process that is currently underway in Europe, but also what is happening right in front of our doorstep, the processes of disintegration, where the former Soviet Union is dissolved and the resulting nationalisms. Of course, I cannot provide recipes for all these issues, but I might be able to offer a couple of reasons and thoughts. So I chose this provocative title because always, if I talk about these issues, people ask me, do I want to return to the nation state? And for the first time, I wrote this down now. And I first want to stress, there is no possible way to return. The main reason for this, we live in the time of nation state, and it's not possible to return. It's an aspirational thought. We cannot return the different points of change during the First World War, the dissolution of the great empires of Habsburg, of the Ottoman Empire, of the Russian Empire, the emergence of nation-state systems through Paris, and then in 1945, and the post-World War II order, also the colonial empires disintegrated. So the international system now exists in form of nation states, and those are very dynamic processes. So we will be able to tell very soon there is a demand for national statehood. So there are different peoples who demand this still to this day. There are examples that existing states that have undergone fusion. We could say Portugal, Spain, Italy. That does not exist anymore. The only case is East Germany merging with West Germany. And the United Arab Republic is also another case that disintegrated quickly again. So states are resistance against their own dissolution. And Czechoslovakia is another example. And also Czechia, Slovenia, that's on the list of countries that was divided. So it's not clear how these different parts of the countries will be distributed. But there are also examples of a division of sovereign nation states. And most of these, the majority of states are small. Not only states are democratizable, but the only big institutions that are democratizable, we could think here of Apple. It's not, but it's not democratizable. But the Switzerland is, for example. Let's look at the numbers. We can tell that since the Second World War, the number of sovereign nation states has increased. The world population has also increased a lot. Now in 2020, the trends continue up until today. So the world population has become enormous. The number of sovereign nation states has doubled. So the average number of people per state has increased, but not dramatically. Now we have arrived around 34 million people per state. So if you look at the median, so that's if you look at what's in the middle, and 50% of all the nation states are smaller than 7 million people. So Berlin would also fall into this list. That's very important for my argument that I will be making later on, because the numbers do not necessarily reflect the fact that a state might be small doesn't mean necessarily that it's unstable. We can also see the process of decolonization that went on after 1950, from starting in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. 700 million people were living under colonial domination, and this number has gone down to 0. So we can see that they are now members of the UN. So the law of the states does not discriminate. There's no difference. So national sovereignty is, in this respect, a very important instrument for small states, because if we think about the small states, they have in principle, they have the right that their sovereignty cannot be infringed. And that it does not only count for big states such as the US, China, and Russia. This leads to another question. States are legal constructions. We're always part of a nation-state system. There are no monads. The history of the state system is always a history of the relations between states, but not only of one single nation state. If we think about the different phases where nation states were created, states are democratizable. What counts as a democracy, we can argue about that. Certain states are counted as democratic. We can argue for a long time. And the political science, they like to make these different lists. If you look at different lists, you still get a feeling what is going on. So there are 5 different systems of rankings regarding democracies. And we can still see one very significant number. A lot more countries are being counted as democracies. And I would say, if you look at it, we don't have to fall into desperation. Of course, that is related to the fact that nation states have citizens, and that these citizens, they have the ability, they have a right as citizens, they have a right to demand that their government looks after them. And that's the problem of oligarchic states, that there could be people who would demand a right to participate. And as long as it's not in the constitution of said nation state, that it's not really the fact in any constitution except for the Catholic churches that citizens would not have that right. So if we return to the question of the state, of course, there are certain examples, certain cases where this has not been the case, and you would not want to live in these places. For example, consider Somalia. If you also think about Iraq, Libya, Yemen. So through external impositions and interventions, criminal structures took over the national state. And you cannot say any longer that there are certain rights guaranteed there. And without states, no right. And there is no law there which citizens could use to level up their demands. So people who are living on the territory of a failed state, they are at the mercy of said criminal structures. So most people know to value nation states, which cannot be said of the cosmopolitans, of the internationalists who live in very stable nation states. Of course, we could also talk about the conditions in Palestine. Palestinians would like nothing else than a sovereign nation state. And they are told that they cannot have this with a ferocity or by a state that has learned since the inception of Zionism, that it's very important to have a nation state in one where every person is a citizen with certain rights. So there is a huge fight where to draw these boundaries between different states and who has the right to be a citizen of a certain state, along with all the rights that go along with it. So there, we can say there are the progressive possibilities for democratization in the nation states. And it's important to keep those possibilities alive. And to defend them against attacks. So there are a number of failed states, but not too many. So we can see that around 10% of the nation states, of all the sovereign nation states, they cannot provide their elementary state functions. They cannot guarantee stability anymore. Just 1 second. So now I want to introduce a couple of terms. So for the future discussion, that is very important. That might sound very academic and formal, but you will realize that it's very important as an instrument to understand what is happening in the world. So nation states are organizations that are categorically distinct. So there is a boundary, a border between different nation states. And at the same time, they have peoples that live in territory. So this categorical distinction is often impinged upon these territories and these peoples. So for example, if you consider Dutch and German people, this border might seem artificial, and the peoples in these countries, those are human contexts of interaction, of identification with fluid transitions. So the same can be said about Russians and Ukrainians. In state processes, on the other hand, there are also certain national identities that come from it, that emerge out of certain historical contexts. And these categorical distinctions, the people also accepted. So a Dutch person lives in a country that has been conquered by Germany 2 times. They would not say today, oh, I'm German. They would be very grateful that at the time they could regain their sovereignty. So it's also the inception of national identities. It also happens in very complex situations and fields. And I would also say that of the left, they're also very dependent of the ability to govern, of the different fluidities between the nation states. My favorite example in this regard is, just to exemplify what the problems here are, the Südtirol, there was always thought about. So Germany had an interest. So it was a valley where the so-called Ladiner lived. They also talked their own language, and they were also always considered Germans. But on the other hand, the Italians, they considered them Italians. And they were telling them, actually, you're Italians. So over years and centuries, there were different conflicts. And in retrospect, there's a very irresponsible politics, of course, of Hitler and Mussolini at the time. And there was an agreement reached that the people there would move to Russia. And these unique things that are happening in these contexts of conflict. And after the war, this exceptional politician comes along, Monokinsky, and he becomes Minister for Foreign Defense and starts negotiating the Südtirol Pact. So in this case, there was an exceptional status negotiated. And considering how centralized Italy is, with an exceptional status, the Italian government accepted that the people from Südtirol, if they were considered themselves too dominated by the Italian government, they could move to Austria. That has never happened in the meantime. They have been unified in a wonderful way. There are still distinctions, and The cuisine is something between pasta and knödel. I can really recommend it. This is a very good solution that reflects the diversity of different peoples, of the cultures, of the historical institutions, and that has been mobilized in a very productive manner. And old conflicts in the 50s, the people from Südtirol on the right, they were afraid that this agreement would not hold. There were certain terrorist activities, and they were able to stop them.
So the second line here says that if we talk about national states, then we can assume that states will sometimes include various groups of people who identify themselves as peoples, so multinational states, and there are many of them. That means that these states organize societies as political units, but there are various groups with different languages, different regions, different historical experiences in the state. So the question is, how does one manage it? There is a wide range of solutions. Management of diversity, you could say. States manage things or they don't. France showed how in the 19th century, a very small proportion of the inhabitants, only about 20%, spoke French, but then the language was expanded. And it was expanded through education. And if you didn't speak proper French, you'd be hit at school. And so the language is spread. But there were also federal solutions by which groups of people are given autonomy. And that is a progressive path which has often been followed. But as globalism has shown, sometimes the institutions one creates for a federal setup are taken over, such as in Catalonia or Scotland, by groups which are not federalist, but by political movements which want more autonomy, which want sovereignty and independence. The Scots would be Scots, but in other cases, let's say the Austrians or Germans and Italians in South Tyrol is a situation which is a bit more complex. So there is the concept of irredentism, where people want to change from one nation to another, which we've seen there. It's extremely dangerous. In a civilized system of states, hopefully such problems will be able to be solved in a peaceful way. States are always involved in the development of nations. When people live together for a while as a state, they have common identities, experiences, visions of the world. We have to give up the idea that everyone has the same idea of the world. It's not the case. And we can't believe that these visions of the world are just different on an individual level, not on a collective level. No, things are done differently in Afghanistan to in China, and in Switzerland differently to in Germany. And sometimes in Switzerland, things are done differently in one canton to another. Those are traditions. in left-wing thinking they don't exist, but in reality, they are incredibly important. And politicians need to learn to manage them, because otherwise, if they don't learn to do that, then there will be bloodshed everywhere. I can remember the early Soviet Union, where Lenin was of the view that the country Russia, an empire of multiple peoples, should be followed by a setup in which each people could decide whether they want to form their own state or not. So it was not that problematic for him, because he thought the whole world would be organized in Soviet republics. So it wasn't that important whether a country belonged to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics led by Moscow or not. So the Soviets' minority policy was extremely supportive of secessionism. But if that led to a civil war and benefited an external support of an internal civil war, then that wouldn't be feasible. And then the freedom of succession can then become a threat to the security of the state. I will go into that in a bit more detail. In principle, one can say, when states reach the limits of integration of so when states are categoric organizations for managing a territorially fixed population, and they're categorically distinguished. And when we find cases in which there has been succession, such as in Yugoslavia, the question is always, did the people want this? Did people not want to live together in the same state? But they feel not represented by the state, or was it due to external interference that this happened? Or was it that they felt that only they could solve their own problems? And to conclude, the key terms are diversity, ability to integrate, integration, and differentiation. You can compare states and different types of states. I don't want to go into too much detail, but you can see that the logics are not too different. Horizontally, states can be divided into many small or a few large units, and they can be symmetrical or asymmetrical. Now, they can be much bigger or much smaller, and states which are very similar or not. The difference between state systems and states here is that some are when some are sovereign and others there are multiple ones. The limits of federalism and centralism also there's also a difference. In Switzerland, the cantons are so different that the question is whether they can really be part of the same country. They've got different taxes, different licensing processes, and so on. So states are either centralist or federalist, and state systems are either imperial or they follow the principle of equal sovereignty. Imperialism doesn't exist in the world of the UN. Equal sovereignty means that large and small states have exactly the same right in the UN General Assembly, but we know that the very large states then have set up a security mechanism, the UN Security Council. So now I want to just go in and drink a bit of water. I'd like to discuss a couple of problems. Just with some keywords, I'll want to go through this list. And then it's time for questions and to continue. So I'll leave the list up. So to go back to the last table I showed, integration and differentiation. Monism, everything is the same. Federalism divided up, and separatism separating into states. And then as internalization or externalization of diversity. That's what this is about, different ways of managing it. So either this diversity is contained in one state or it's divided up into different ones. You can describe that under the term complexity. Is complexity integrated, or is it does it lead to division? And that's an important distinction. We'll come back to it in the context of the EU. How can the diversity of countries' experiences and interests be managed as best as possible? Through division, or through a monist state or a federal state, instead of through shared sovereignty? And it's important to note the second point, being small is not bad. It's not a problem. You don't have to be big. If you look at statistics, well, they can be interpreted in different ways. And if you look at the size of a state and estimate how peaceful it is, and how strong the welfare state is, and then the result is always that the smaller ones always tend to be more successful than the large ones. There is a series of possible reasons. Left-wingers are shocked when you say social homogeneity and makes policy many things easier, but that's the case. It's easy to agree when you have the same tradition, and that you can follow the same framework for running a political system. If I was to spend years on Italian politics, and if I were to study it over many years, if I were to learn Italian, then I still wouldn't understand Italian politics perfectly, because there are some principles which you have to just get used to, and you wouldn't know that if you just got about them if you just got dropped there. So size and heterogeneity, they co-vary. The larger a state is, then the more likely it is that a country's population will be more diverse, so they correlate. Larger countries tend to become dictatorial, in particular in economic crises. The heterogeneity of the society of such a state in a multinational state that is managed by through centralization, through repressing the periphery. Turkey is a good example. China's become increasingly dictatorial over the last few years. I don't need to mention Russia. Size is often a reason why a country isn't organized or can't be organized in a democratic or reasonably liberal way. For state systems and for states, an issue is that they can become too large. All empires have such a problem because they tend to take on so much periphery that they can no longer be properly ruled from the center. Rivalry between the identities of groups on the periphery and therefore emerges. these groups discover, for example, that they'd spoken Russian for 200 years, but then they realized that they were actually Ukrainians. So then that leads to separation and division of identity. They feel that the central management of the state doesn't care about them because they see they have X and Y and A, B, C. And this kind of conflict, conflicts then arise. The rich provinces feel that they are excessively taxed, and the money goes to support the periphery. Catalonia is a very good example of that. They don't want to pay for the Spanish kingdom and to keep the country together by taxing the areas where people earn more and subsidizing other areas. Many people are not happy with that and want to leave the country. The permutations of conflicts are huge. There's a huge number of possibilities. Regarding state systems, there is always the question. Well, imperialist states systems are state systems in which there is a power gradient. That means that there are more powerful and less powerful states, a center and a periphery. The problem with such a structure is how long will the center be willing to peacefully keep the periphery on board? When will the income from the empire for the center remain or become lower, in fact, than the cost? When will the people rebel? In the EU, we've got the center with Germany and France at the heart, and then the periphery. For keeping Europe together through the euro and the structural funds, had a lot of payments being made, and the rich countries are paying, but how long will they be willing to do that? There are parts in the center which benefit from the empire through the export industry, so parts of the population, I mean, and there are other parts of the population which don't. So if we're talking about solidarity with Italy, which is the case here, then how long will people put up with it? So at the center, decisions will thus be taken about the relationship between the center and the periphery. There has been a long discussion on the question of how peace is set up between states. It took place in the 1930s in the domain of German state law. So would it be possible to have an egalitarian sovereignty, an egalitarian peace, in which different states would protect peace together without one being responsible for the others at a price? Carl Schmitt, who developed theories in the 19th century, there was President Monroe, said no state in the American hemisphere can enter an alliance against the US. So no state in the Americas. That was something the Americans would not accept. The hegemon announced that, and we know what happened in Chile or Cuba, when it even looked possible that a state would enter such an alliance. If we transfer that to another part of the world and focus on the peace issue, then we will have to ask the question, how all the small states near large states have to act to ensure that their sovereignty does not become a threat to the larger states, and to avoid an imperialist reaction. Cuba was a fantastic example. I'm a big fan of peace, as you may know. I think Cuba demonstrates this. Fidel Castro came to power, even though the CIA had started the Bay of Pigs invasion to destroy the regime right from the start. So it was a failure. It was led by Kennedy at the start of his time in power. Cuba remained under Castro's government. So many Americans then decided to boycott Cuba. And they managed to implement a boycott. Cuba then turned to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union thought about what to do, and then sent rockets to Cuba to protect itself and Cuba from the USA. And that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans saw that, and then negotiations started. Subsequently, quite rightly, Kennedy was celebrated as a man who saved the lives of my generation. There was no nuclear strike by either side. And the story could be reconstituted step by step by the historians. Khrushchev and Kennedy were clever enough to see that the Soviet Union could just withdraw these rockets. A deal was done. There was a negotiated settlement. But the negotiations were secret. And the issue was what would happen to the mid-range rockets which the USA had set up in Turkey against the USSR. That was never officially part of the negotiations, but Khrushchev and Kennedy agreed that half a year afterwards, half a year after the Russian rockets were taken away from Cuba, and then quite secretly, the US ballistic missiles would be withdrawn from Turkey. The Soviets were clever enough never to talk too much about that, but the relations between the two leaders was good enough to make that possible. And the USA stuck to their agreement. The withdrawal was made 6 months later. Solving security problems in such a balanced way that they do not end up as wars was the great achievement we saw there. Have we got another 5 minutes? And then we can respond to the audience's questions. So the fifth point is as follows. If you say national state, then people say, well, is it always made up of one nation? No, it can be made up of several nations. A nation state, I mean. And then nation states are not monads which just exist on their own. Monads. I was just looking for a word. they are not autarkic, essentially. So the existence of the modern nation states since the Westphalian Peace after the 30 Years' War of 1648 tells us something else, and shared understanding of what a state has developed. The main aim of 1648 was to end the wars of religion, and that was done by setting up a system of states based on a principle which we no longer want to understand: cuius regio eius religio. So the ruler determines the religion. So if you go to Cologne, for example, you have to become Catholic. That ended the religious wars, despite the disadvantages. It was understood by the states. There was a federal court where suits could be brought if this was not respected, and the emperor was in Vienna, but he didn't have that much of a say, in fact, on matters, and it was the states which managed their own affairs collectively. And what I want to say now is that in the American discussion, people talk about Westphalian states. Since I come from Westphalia, I thought that was a reference to Westphalia, but it was about the kind of state which derived from the Westphalian peace, which was directly integrated into a system of states. The Charter of the UN says a shared responsibility for peace, and it comes from that. In the context of the Ukraine war, this principle has been completely forgotten. The UN Charter does not just give right for defense. That would be a solipsistic situation. If something does something to you, then you can defend yourself. No, all states have a duty before a conflict takes place to think about what you could do to avoid the conflict. It aims to manage peace, not war. The states share responsibility for creating peace. Otherwise, a system of states would not function. And that means, for example, that a wish for negotiating before a war cannot be rejected. We can take that for granted. So if somebody's saying, what on earth are you doing on my western or eastern borders? What is the purpose of this? Then the other state has to give a response. That is the duty which can be derived from the fact that nation states are in a system of equal sovereignty. And then just small states, large states. There are lots of suggestions that small states are not just do not just do better economically in terms of the social welfare state. We see that in Scandinavia, but we also see that small states have fewer veto points, as we say in political science. The smaller a state is, the easier it is to learn creatively and create new ways of working. States look at what each other do. They learn from each other. They're not isolated. They affect each other horizontally. So we've seen, for example, in Scandinavia, about 20 years ago, a large city started to say, we want to become carbon neutral. They got on with it. They just worked on it. They didn't wait for the Paris Agreement. And even in Cologne, which moves forward slowly, I've seen that people saw that if Stockholm and Copenhagen could do it, well, then they could do it. I don't know whether Cologne could do it, but people there want it, at least. And this form of learning from each other. Well, the American constitutional theory has described the USA state as laboratories of democracy. Each state can develop a solution which is specific to its problems, and those solutions can then be taken on by other states because they've then been tested. So I don't want to go too far, but the last sentence is more or less, well, I'm known for not being too keen on the EU. And I want to say that the imperial structure of the EU is dominated by Germany and France, or just Germany, and the center of power. There is a hierarchical dimension. And first, I'd like to say that's not feasible in the long term. It's undemocratic. And so there is a center which rules a periphery, and a German historian said that the alternative is sovereign states cooperating as equals, and that can be done. In modern language, that would be a network structure. If you go to Brussels and you say, if you go to lunch with a bureaucrat from Brussels, we could have that. Then they'd say Europe à la carte, and that's not something they're keen on. You could also call it Europe of variable geometry. Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy want to build a railway line, let's say. Why do they need Brussels? They could all do it together. They could do it better if they had to do it at European level. That could be a model, a network of cooperation based on free will. My argument is that if we have luck, that may be where things are going, because this centralistic system is failing because of its own heterogeneity. In the south, Mediterranean countries are suffering from the euro. In the east, countries are suffering from the attempt to impose the Western way of life. It's kind of cultural imperialism, and the Scandinavians think that they can do everything better than anyone else. So if you look at that, well, overall, everywhere there were fractures. An international order of equal sovereignty on the basis of cooperation could instead be built up. So thank you very much. We can now take individual questions.
Thank you very much. I'll be managing the microphone. If somebody has a question, please raise your hand. Okay, we have a question right here. So, right, I have a question. So, you like the small state, and you could say that Switzerland is better off than Baden-Württemberg, but still, you could say the big states, we can also see that a big state is attacking a small state. Russia is attacking Ukraine, and Ukraine wants to join the European Union, and Russia is afraid of NATO. So what about the state in which there's big states, also the US? If there's a big structure, how can we reach that also small states want to achieve this or the international order? So yeah, there is no international government. Of course, if we would have one body, then they could say, okay, you, Russia, you're not allowed to do this. No, but this is not the case. So all these questions have to be negotiated horizontally. And the case of Finland, as long as the Soviet Union existed, they pursued a politics which consisted on the one hand, they were integrated into the Western democratic world, but they, on the other hand, they also tried to avert all the Russian tinted possibilities. And you could also call it the Finlandization. So you could also say, well, Finland should join NATO, but they said, no, we would prefer not to. So now the question of Ukraine has a very long history, and I'm sure you're not unaware of it. And this history extends back to 30 years. And there was always the question, and Russia always posed this question again, what happens with our security? And from this, the question was posed, what happens if an autonomous Ukraine, could they enter NATO? But also the second question, should we encourage the integration of Ukraine into NATO? So we all knew that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. In a weird situation, this happened through a weird decision of the Soviet Union at the time. And there is also a place called Bastupol, where the Russian Black Sea fleet is sailing. And the question is, what happens to the Russian fleet and the Black Sea? So yeah, what happens if you have a small, weak state and it stands opposite a strong state? So what happens? I'm sorry, no, this is not relatable. The political reason on every side should see. So it should have been possible for the Ukraine to become a peaceful Western country without accepting American missiles on its territory. And that emanates from the principle of the peace order that goes before the war. So what happens to, so it's the responsibility of the entire state system to think of solutions before war breaks out. So how should I put this? It's a political formulation. If you listen to our journalists, then they will say the Ukraine must have every right to join NATO. This is why I say no, then NATO must have the right to say no if somebody wants to join them. For very good reasons, NATO has a law where it can say no. Georgia could not say that tomorrow we want to be part of NATO. No, also NATO has a responsibility to think about the consequences. So then NATO would have to answer the question, what would it mean in practice if Georgia would become a NATO member state? So there are very long discussions also in the US. If there should be differentiations between NATO member states, and the answer to this question was always no. So, because then the US has the possibility to build any conceivable military infrastructure on that said territory. So the fragile conditions that should furnish peaceful and sovereign nation states. And I will add, in this system, it's always possible that accidents will happen. Of course, that will always happen. Only in this case, who was participating in this accident and who was not responding appropriately in these situations. We could look back and assess these different decisions. So of course, if you want to have a non-imperialist solution, that means in German, it means that Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, they are sovereign nation states that are not governed from Moscow. Then we would have to furnish conditions for Moscow to accept these sovereign nation states in its peripheries. So the same has to be talked about with Cuba, for example, just to finish on this note.
In the case of Ukraine, there were also other issues. The elite in power in Kiev was not willing to to accept the Russian-speaking part of the population as of equal value in the statement of multiple peoples in Ukraine, and that's led to the new Cold War. It's one of the facts, one of the factors. Yes, it's not unusual in these social radicalization processes. The problem is that people deny that there are these gradual transitions. It is a kind of monist way of thinking of a state. People think that if they make some kind of concession, allow some kind of autonomy to develop, then there'll be irredentism. Then people want to be part of Russian, then the enemy will be in our own country. And we find that issue in a lot of what the Americans call nation building processes. So I'd say the foreign offices are full of people who know that. And you can really discover this in advance always. E.M. Saroy, I don't know what EM stands for, but there's a man called E.M. Saroy, and so EM like the chocolate, and is a thinker who is as pro-establishment as you can get among American historians. And he had access to all the White House's documents from the start of the New World Order, George Walker Bush, and in the 1990s, until Putin took power, the end of the 90s. And what he had access to, which is particularly important, with the transcripts of the telephone conversation, which Clinton had with Yeltsin, Kohl, Mitterrand, and so on. That was extremely interesting. Helmut Kohl, well, we always thought he is not really that to it. Well, he is extremely clear. He says, I understand that Poland and the Baltics need to join NATO. I understand that they cannot, but you cannot accept a special statute. There was all the Western South African states as well, but do not touch Ukraine. That was Kohl who said that. It was completely clear then who among these elites who had taken that decision. Kohl didn't say, you promised to Gorbachev that if Eastern Germany would such and such. No, those are just details. But he said, you can't touch Ukraine. And Clinton said, thank you for saying that so clearly. But then in 2000, he couldn't be a candidate for the following elections. I'm talking about the American president. There was another Bush afterwards, and then he took things at a different pace. 4 to 5 intercontinental agreements between the USSR and the USA was still in force. And the 1990s presidents in the USA had supported them. So agreements on limiting armaments, the arms race, so on, from the Reagan Reagan time period. But anyway, the second Bush terminated them all. And then in 2008, when he left the presidency, the European arms expenditure was 115% of the Cold War levels. But if you look at the curve, then it makes me dizzy. You can see how the expenditure on arms went up during the War on Terror. The USA was also not intending to build a peaceful international order with no violence. From the beginning of the New World Order, there was not a single day in which the USA was not involved in a war. No day at all. Forever war. Carried out with the most modern military technology. The Russians had nothing comparable. Until the start of the 2000s, they had virtually no armaments and virtually no money. The Chinese are gradually on the way up. One of the most amazing line graphs is the Chinese arms expenditure since 2005. The Americans are much higher, but you can see the Chinese straight line. The Russian arms budget was not like that. At the start of the war, it was about 10% higher than Germany's. It's hardly possible to imagine. Maybe it's 20% higher now. We're all cheating, of course, filling the figures. But they had a huge number of nuclear warheads. So the conventional forces had to be weaker than the German ones because all the money was going into nuclear. So Habermas, Koch and others 3 years ago called for the creation of a European army. And they said, why do we want a European army? Not because of Russia, because if France, Germany and Great Britain are taken together, then their weapons budget is 3 times as high as Russia's. 3 times as high. So these relationships, which will play a role in the background, have to be taken into account. Was it wise in this situation, given that the legacy of the USSR had to be managed? And to take countries out of Moscow's orbit in such a way, did it make sense to terminate the arms control agreement? I would say absolutely not, because people knew how difficult the legacy was which they had to manage. If you look at the UN Charter, then there is a duty to uphold peace, not a duty to fight wars.
So it's my turn now. Thank you very much for this play for the small is beautiful. So your argument that there is no economies of scale with states. So let's consider the second biggest economy of the world, China. You mentioned it. So I want to challenge you on this. So what about the development of the last 30 years? The Human Development Index, the GDP. So if I think about the digital economy, So there's a pool of 1 billion human people. They want to build a sector that can compete with the Silicon Valley. They want to set international standards. So, for example, Switzerland cannot afford this. So what can compete with this is that the European standard law worldwide, it can set these standards. Switzerland cannot do this. So yes, China is a very fascinating case. To address your question, what are the global linkages there? Since 1990, the Americans pursued an intentional politics of integrating China into the world economy to deindustrialize their own economy. So the US has become the initiator of goods produced in China. And they also invested a lot into American state finances. On the basis of the profits, the technological innovation was made possible in China. You cannot refute this. The Chinese knew they would not be able to give that further on. There was this very famous formulation of Xi Jinping in front of the National Party Congress. He said, well, how was it again? Do your thing. Don't talk about it. And have a good hope for the future. He knew very well that on the world basis, China's rise would lead to a lot of structural tensions where China would compete against the dollar as the worldwide currency. And this has also been leading up to a lot of military conflicts. So you cannot only see this in economic terms, but as part of the big system where the rise of China, it has become a lot more asymmetrical. And you're right. China and Russia play a role. When I understood that correctly, only to a third it has been modernized. There's still a huge reserve there. They have these problems of population growth, etc.
Yes, the topic of the economy is just mentioned. I think it would make sense. It would be great now, following the topic of statehood, to move to the topic of the economy. I wonder how realistic it is. We're in a time in which the globalization, not just of finance, but also of work forces, also has a significant impact on statehood. Could you comment on that? What do you think? Could you just say in more detail what you mean by that? Well, I'd like to leave the question open. I don't want to give an example. I don't want to dictate the direction. In Germany, we're not just living in, it's also a democracy. It's part of the state. I mean, it's the democracy is part of the state. And very often, however, we cannot vote on the economic system. The global nature of things and the global corporations have an impact on the statehood, but what? I understand now. Thank you. I'm a fan of small units. I think that was clear. If you apply that to the economy, then, well, I've always argued that we face the problem that the dynamic of capitalism and growth should be tamed in such a way that it benefits people more. You could call it a socialist program. Where can that happen? That's the question you're asking. What role can democracy play in that context? I would argue that democratic decisions have to be possible on, for example, free trade mandates. In my last book, I used the example of Spain, of pigs rather. 30% of the pigs slaughtered in Germany go to China. China is largely an agrarian country. They can be sold there. And they can be sold there because there are EU rules on the space in which a mother pig, a sow, lives, eats, gives birth. If we didn't want to do that, treat pigs in this way, then we wouldn't be able to export them. But because we're in the EU, the sows which are grown according to EU conditions can then be sold in our supermarket, and our farmers are capable of doing that. So I believe that a large part of what is seen as economic policy or internal market policy, which we consider something other than politics, needs to be reintegrated into politics, so that the political units have more freedom to take decisions. The EU has the problem that it acts in a system of an unlimited free market laid down by the WTO. You can't make any exceptions anymore, virtually. And there is also unlimited movement of capital, and not just within the EU, but also between the EU and third countries. In the treaty, we find the typical sentence that no capital controls within or across the EU's borders. But the result is that we are stuck in the international flows of capitals limitlessly.
So I have a rhetorical question. Maybe you can answer it, maybe not. You gave a couple of indications what could have been done before the Ukraine war between Russia and Ukraine. We've also seen this very clearly, what could have been done. You also say that the politicians who are responsible, it could not be the case that all of them are stupid once of a sudden. So why were a lot of these things not perceived, not discussed? And why are a lot of people defamed in a way as if they just entered in this world? But I could also understand it very well if you would not want to answer this right now. So here at the back, we'll also take the last question. Ralf Kremmer is my name. So I think it already got clear during the talk, the sovereignty is very important. So it's not only sovereignty on paper. So states, they have to accept certain realities of power in the international system. That's not only holds true for Russia. Also Germany and the Western states are usually different. They also pressure other states massively. You also mentioned the military side of the US. But also, if I look at how they behave internationally, that's not reality. So I am of the opinion that the last part of the talk was missing. What about the state system in its entirety? We would have to discuss it. So what about imperialism? What about the state system? So the German chancellor uses the word, he means Russia. We can also talk about if it's imperialist, but it's dependent of the term of imperialism you have. It should be clear to everybody that there is one imperial country on this world in its entirety, irrespective of the exact definition you might have. It's not Russia, it's not China. But all international conflicts, it's not really about the politics of bringing peace to these conflicts, but it's about, I think this is also the case. And I think the decisive distinction between this and other more or less imperial states is that the other states, they always want to control their surroundings, but the US wants to rule over the whole world. And I think I was missing this context. If we also talk about how the system is exactly. So thank you very much for this thing that helped me against the coughing. So we have to have more free trade to produce these kind of medications. So we can go directly at it. Capitalism is, since its inception, there has never been capitalism without statehood. And it always requires a host state in order to expand. The sequence that can always be cited is Genua, the Netherlands. Capitalism is always expansive and is dependent upon the fact that there's a center and a periphery, whereas the center accumulates capital and expands into previously unexpanded territories. And they want to include those territories into the accumulation process. So China is a classical case. So you can say this. Now, you could also say, I can also recommend my last book. It's called Between Globalism and Democracy, the Political Economy in the Ending Neoliberal Period. And I explored what happens to the empire that capitalism needs. And what I argued is that the center is not always happy. So the Chinese took over from the Dutch. And it was also moving from the Netherlands to Great Britain. So there were rivalries with other empires. And in the end, the US took over. And only after the Second World War, the US was able to have this role as the policeman of the entire world. So there are different crises also in the center. And at the end, such empires can become very costly. In the US, you can see that very clearly. The American population, I lived there for 12 years of my life. They always say Streeck he's an anti-American. No, I lived in this country for 12 years and I know it very well. In the center of it, society is dead. And it's dead and rotten in a way you can't even imagine. And inequality rises in the same way as the costs, the state expenditure for arms rises as well. It's also the prison population rises dramatically every year. To a very large extent, this has to do with the way how the US dominates the world to this day. On the other hand, it's not that bad because the stronger it is, the longer it can introduce its own standards everywhere. Otherwise, its debts would become a problem. The private debts of private households, they rise into the sky, and this country is really rotten, it's dead. And the problems that emanate from an empire, the costs have to be smaller than the benefits, and the benefits should be distributed to its entire population, but this is not happening. Since the 1970s, the US will not be able to extend its empire for much longer. We cannot predict what will happen, but a model for societal stability is not the US, irrespective of its huge military power. It's not stable. You can also see that on this basis. There are resistance mushrooming everywhere, either in the middle of the US, I'm sorry, in the middle of the Americas, there might be different dictatorships. They're always on their toes. This cannot go on for much longer for good. Thank you very, very much. I think I will stop here. One more question we can maybe. My question was, if before the war between the Ukraine and Russia, if it were known in advance, you could also find it out on many other places. If really so many people knew that, if also the politicians who were responsible, if they knew all of this, why was it not possible to arrive at different solutions? And why are other people, such as you, who voice these thoughts, why are you being defamed? Why are you portrayed as stupid old people? Do you have an explanation why we're heading so steep into catastrophe? So even if it's steep, so we have the idea of the kettle that is boiling. The frog in it doesn't notice it because it's only getting warmer bit by bit. So human awareness would already assume this condition of crisis as normal. But I will go further. if I discuss politics today, I discuss it in the context of dilemmas. This world is really wicked. You can do one thing and you destroy another. You always destroy something. If you close a hole here, you open another one there. It's not as if other people didn't know that. So the American military apparatus is bigger than any military apparatus in human history. So if you drive by CIA headquarters, it does not stop the number of houses. And there's so many people working there. What are they working exactly? So they work on strategies. So one of the strategic discussions, they fall into the Thucydides trap. That was the Greek historian who wrote down the history of the Peloponnesian War. He was also a general, Thucydides, of the Attic army. The history of that war is being reread all the time, and for very good reasons, because Thucydides arrives at the conclusion Athens was a democracy such as the US today. They were dominating its surroundings. So it was, there was another city also on the Peloponnese. It was Sparta, and they were growing stronger. And Athens knew that at one point, that Sparta would at one point attack the supremacy of Athens. And they were thinking about the question, when do we have to attack them first? When do we have to launch the preemptive strike? So the American debate calls this the Thucydides trap. You're sitting in it, you're looking out, and you see it always piling up. And you're wondering, what could I do? Thucydides thinks that Athens attacked too late. So he was a real realpolitiker. So Athens was watching for too long. They should have sent out their troops earlier, and so they lost. So you have to think, is how American strategists perceive the competition with China and Russia. They're considering how long can we hold this competition before they attack our unity, before they attack the US dollar as the world's currency. So you can also see as the Thucydides trap as Putin sitting in it. And he's also wondering, how long can I take the Ukraine rising? And the Ukraine has spent a lot on military. And on one particular point, Putin might have had the thought also when one of his generals showed him the history of the Peloponnesian War, because the problem would have had to be different, because he knew how miserable his army was. And he knew it had to be miserable. It had to compete with the US military. There was nothing else left, no more money left. This form of strategic planning, all of them do it. Is there one of them who says, listen, now we'll stop this? There's one fundamental principle above all, is that there should be no war. We have to find a solution with which everybody is happy without starting a war. And this is not happening. This is not happening. These military elites generals, they cannot do this. What they can do is calculate how many Leopold II tanks are needed. Even the most intelligent politicians. Now, if you want to ask a pragmatic question, I would say for Germany, it would have to be made clear that we pursue politics, that we support politics where we cannot define the goals. Now we could say, okay, there's a war going on, we cannot just watch, we have to do something, we have to act. But at least we should be able to say that, okay, we help to this and this end. I don't want to die for one Ukrainian city, but also as citizens when we talk about this. War is not a computer game, because people are killed for real. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want to join this? Because in these concrete situation, the big line has been reached. If the politicians tell us that we do this, that the Ukrainians are dying for our values, and I respond, now, if we let other people die for our values and we watch, and we only send them every now and then some ammunition, now, if this really was the case, we would have to go there ourselves. Even just as Oskar Fischer said in the Serbian War, Auschwitz on the ground, that we have to bombard them. You have to bombard them from above. I never understood this, because if there were really Auschwitz on the ground, we would have to send troops on the ground. But no, we dissolved military conscription in Germany. If that was really the case, then we would have to go there ourselves. And we have to explain to the people that if they accept such rhetoric, they cannot say, we don't want to send our own daughters and sons. If there really is such an existential enemy, understood in the terms of Carl Schmitt, then if we don't exterminate the enemy, then we will be exterminated. This is how it sounds. Because then the consequence would be, we should pack our stuff and we should go there and join the Ukrainians in their war. All of us can challenge this rhetoric. Why? What's the goal? What's the final condition? This is where I would say, very good. To what situation should we return? Should we say that also Crimea belongs to Ukraine in the long run? Our foreign minister, that's what she's saying, that Putin has to come to the International Criminal Court. And here I would say, no, I'm not willing to spend a single euro on this. We always have to reiterate, people are dying there and people are being killed. This is not fun. I'm telling you, I'll finish soon. I can say at the time, the ancient Roman army, if it returned for 3 months on the campo, on the market, they were not allowed to enter the city. They had to calm down, they had to sober up. Because they were afraid that if the soldiers returned immediately, if you also look at the prison population in the US, the veterans of foreign wars, they are overrepresented massively in the prison population. Even those who win war. That's not fun. And really, this seriousness has to be brought to the table every time. I have not been part of the war. I was born in 1946. I know what happens when war strikes. Everything was broken. And in that generation, there were a number of people. And having the memory of this, in the Second World War, I was also a teacher for a time in the history department. I was teaching 2 or 3 courses, and I was asking the prospective history teachers if I would ask the prospective history teachers how many people died, they didn't know. And if I told them 50 million, they would be flabbergasted. 50 million people dead. Then we really ask the question, how can this be the price for anything? I was also wondering, I also looked at Engels, who was a military strategist. In 1885, he predicted that a world war would break out in Europe, which would lead to 15 million dead people. Why did he say this? Because he would be able to tell how the military budgets kind of all were rising one after the other. And Engels was this kind of military strategist who was able to see that. So this is what you have to say. You don't have to debate if it's just or not. What is the price you're willing to pay for a certain end? What's the price we're willing to pay? And why? Where do we end? Okay. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for coming to Berlin for this talk. And we really look forward to hearing more from you on the website. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the interpreters, Frank. So many thanks for coming. I don't know whether we'll have a talk in May. If so, I don't know who it is. But I'm afraid the next one will probably be in English. But we have very good interpreters. So have a good trip home. Thank you.